So what we're looking at in this particular unit is this idea of the long run from a business point of view and how they can change in order to adapt to the market as the market changes. Full screen. If we look at it, we're going to distinguish between short run and long run. We're going to understand what happens to a firm's output when it increases inputs. And basically, that's what we dealt with last week. There's nothing really new there. We're going to understand why big firms can enjoy great advantages, yet small firms can also be successful. Again, being able to manipulate the market very quickly. Understand why some firms can get too big, the concept of too bigness. Explain what's meant by right-sizing a firm, and how the markets can sometimes be too small, and Newfoundland's a good example of that. So what do we define as the long run? Well, by now, we know that economics is all about choice. Really, we are focused on choice, and when we make choices, there's opportunity cost. When we have opportunity cost, that's the downside of all that choice to us. We can't do everything, basically, and we have to make some choices. And those costs associated with those choices are called opportunity costs. So we make choices in order to maximize our individual and collective benefits. So most companies will try to maximize their profit or maximize their output or maximize something with regards to their productivity. So when analyzing the economic circumstances of a firm, it's important to realize that firms operate in a changing environment. Boy, is that ever true. And that's been proven out in the last year, how the environment changes so greatly. Although it's easier to look at a snapshot of a firm in order to determine its economic health, the reality is it's a continuous operation that changes over time. Now that we've developed an understanding of how to analyze the economic health of a firm in the short run, we will move to a more realistic analysis of the firm. So a realistic analysis of the firm is all factors of production. So we have to be aware as a firm that the long run exists and changes will exist in the market that will certainly change the way things are, and if we ignore that, we'll do it at our peril. So let's look at this differentiation between the short run and the long run. And you know what? There's not really, if you think about it the way the economists think about it. So in the last unit, we looked at the short run costs, and we learned that in the short run, all the factors of production are pretty well fixed. Okay, so land, labor, capital, and enterprise is fixed. We know, however, that firms operate in the long run. And if you think about it, a firm doesn't exist unless it's one of these Christmas markets that's gone by December 24th. The fact of the matter is that most firms plan to be around for a long, long time. So the fact is that they are operating in the long run, or are thinking in the long run. Their thinking should be in the long run. Even though they operate in the short run, physically they operate in the short run, they have a plan for the long run. So the long run is a continuous operation of the firm well into the future. So by definition, the long run involves an analysis of the firm in which all the factors of production, land, labor, capital, and enterprise, are absolutely variable. So everything can change in the long run, and it usually does. So firms operate in the short run, but to analyze the long run, we must look at the long run really as a series of short runs. Now that's a one line, but that line is important. What it says is that, one way we can analyze the long run is to consider the long run as being made up of a bunch of little short runs. So a week is made up of 7 days. We consider a day to be the short run. The week is the long run, but really it is 7 days or 7 short runs that comprise to make the long run. And really, the long run is just a successive group of short run operations, okay? So change is incremental. So in the short run, we say that firms experience a decline in their marginal capacity. We talked about that last week, how, okay, we build our production level. So we go from one employee to 2 employees to 3 employees to 4 employees in order to get our production up. But what we find is that as we add employees, our production goes up to a point, and then it starts to decline. So we saw that decline in what's called marginal capacity. In other words, each individual worker coming on board contributes a lot at the beginning, and then it starts to shrink. So as we add that 5th, 6th, 7th, 10th, 15th, 20th, whatever employee, the extra contribution that employee gives starts to decline, okay, at some point. The too many cooks in the kitchen scenario that we talked about last week. So in the long run, this doesn't have to happen. Okay, we really can increase our employees if we increase the size of our factory, we increase the amount of resources, we increase the amount of entrepreneurial talent. If we can increase all of the factors of production, we could really grow a very large business and have it be successful without this decline, because the fact is that the whole organization or all the factors of production grow as opposed to just one. Okay, in the short run, only one is allowed to grow, usually labor, and the rest are held constant for the purposes of analysis. So what we're seeing in the long run is that everything can grow, and if everything can grow, the theory is that, yeah, this marginal capacity shrinkage, or whatever you want to call it, this breaking down of marginal capacity, will also disappear because we can enlarge everything. So to go back to the analogy of adding cooks to the kitchen, in the short run, too many cooks in the kitchen will eventually lead to an overall reduction in the contribution of each relative cook. Well, in the long run, we can simply increase the size of the kitchen to accommodate the extra help and thereby allow us to continue to increase our output. So more cooks in a bigger kitchen, preparing more food, producing more output. So that's effectively what we're talking about in the long run. So like in the short run, there's no difference here really. The idea is to operate in such a capacity that provides the maximum productivity, meaning that we get the most out for the amount we put in. Okay, so we want to be able to get the most output for the minimum minimum input. So we need to be able to squeeze as much out of the lemon as possible. So what do we do there? So both short and long run average costs can really decrease if the price of the factory inputs decrease. So if, for example, we're building widgets and the widgets contain a lot of oil, okay? We use oil in order to make these widgets. If the price of oil drops, the cost of producing widgets will drop. If the price of oil goes up, the cost of producing the widgets will go up. Technological improvements will occur. Okay, we've found a better way to make the widget. So let's say, for example, we used to handcraft the widget. Someone used to get there with a knife and shape the widget, and it would take them 2 hours to make a widget. Now we have a 3D printer, and the 3D printer can print that widget in 1 hour. So what happens is we've doubled our productivity because we can produce one widget in 1 hour as opposed to one widget in 2 hours. So technological improvements come into play to increase the capacity of our output. And mergers reduce the average variable cost of new firm. What do we mean by that? Well, let's say we got firm A and firm B and they're relatively small. Okay, so they're relatively small. They decide to come together in a merger. In other words, two firms become one. So now we got, instead of one factory, we have two factories. So the fact is that we've increased the capacity of our productivity for the firm, and we can receive some benefits of size, meaning that our office staff is the same size in the newly created firm as it was in one firm before. So we had, for example, a payroll department that consisted of 3 people in firm A and a payroll department that consisted of 3 people in firm B. We bring them together, we only need 3 people in the payroll department, and we can still do the same amount of, we can do 2 of the new firm put together with 3 people. So we basically doubled the productivity in the payroll department by having the number of people working there. Now, the poor people who get laid off, it's unfortunate, but mergers are really designed, when we hear tell of business mergers, companies coming together, that's really designed in order to bring this bigness so they can get this economies of scale. And some companies require fairly large economies of scale in order to grow. We've seen it, the latest iteration of mergers that we've normally seen has been in the tech industry, okay? If you were to think about 15 years ago, let's just bring us back 15 years ago. Facebook acquired Instagram. Okay, Instagram was the new up-and-coming program that really appealed to younger people. Facebook was moving into an older demographic. So Instagram was purchased by Facebook. Now, what did Facebook get out of that? Well, they opened up a new market, the younger market. Okay, but they also could use the same systems that they use to manage Facebook. Let's say the payroll department of Facebook. That same payroll department could do Instagram as well. So effectively, they saved expenses on overhead by bringing the two companies together, and the marketing benefits that come of that. There's a whole bunch of potential benefits that can come by joining companies together. Now, from a consumer perspective, consumers have some problems with that, because what that does is it reduces the amount of competition in the marketplace. If two companies were competitors before, if Facebook and Instagram were competitors before, people could say, well, I'm going to choose one platform or another platform because I prefer one over the other. I don't like Facebook. I don't like Mark Zuckerberg or whatever. Now that they've come together, you don't have any choice. You're dealing with Facebook either way you like it. So from a consumer point of view, mergers have not been so good. In Labrador last year, for example, Air Labrador and another company, I forget what it was called, another company merged to create Air Borealis. Well, before there were two competing companies in the Labrador market. The Labrador is only 20,000 people, and very few people live out on the coast. Very, very small market. So what the airlines did is they combined. Instead of competing with one another, they combined to create Air Borealis. That's beneficial to Air Borealis, not so beneficial for the customers, because customers have no other competitive airline now. They have one. Okay, so let's look at some of this stuff mechanically. Now let's look at some of this stuff mechanically. What we have is, this is Rising Sun. Now, just to kind of frame it out for you, let's assume that this Rising Sun company has a plant. Okay, they got one plant, and let's call it plant number one. Okay, the very second column, the first AC in plant one. Let's assume they have a plant, and let's say that's all they have. Just ignore the last three columns. So all we're looking at really are these two columns here. Okay. So what we're thinking about is output of flash drives per day. So we're producing flash drives for a computer. And you can see here are the various levels of output. And here is the cost per unit. This is the average cost in plant one. So to produce 100, the average cost is $6. To produce 200, the average cost is $5. 300, the average cost is $6, $8, $11, $15. So what we're seeing here, if you look at this very quickly, you'll notice that, okay, the average cost of making 100 is 6. And if we double that, or we bring it to 200, we can get the average cost down to 5. So if we looked at this plant, we say, yeah, 5 is a pretty low-cost production. In fact, if we went to 300, the price goes up, or the cost goes up to $6 again. And if we went to 400, it went to $8. You know, why is this happening? You're asking, why is the price going back up? What's happening for this to occur? Well, let's keep in mind that let's assume AC in plant one is the short run. We only have one plant. Okay, we're the Rising Sun company. We're only one plant. Our plant is relatively small. Now we're trying to produce these things, these flash drives, and we say to ourselves, you know, our plant only has so much room, or so many ovens, or so many assembly lines, or so many whatever. So even though we can squeeze a little bit more production out of it, let's say we can bring it up to 200. Once we move into 300, we're running into what's called diseconomies of scale. In other words, we're working our plant too hard. We got too many cooks in the kitchen. The amount of resources, other than labor, or maybe even labor, we just don't have enough people to make that 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800 combination. Our plant is not geared up to make that amount of production, and as a result, we're going to have, you know, overtime costs, extra machine costs, rental costs. These costs that will come as we try to get our production up. Okay, so if we look at AC plant one, AC in plant one, the lowest average cost occurs at 200. So really, the rule is we should say to the company, if we're brought in as consultants, don't produce any more than 200 a day. It's not worth producing any more than 200. Our plant is only so big, it can only produce so much. Once you go past 200, your cost is going to go back up again. Keep your production to 200, okay? So then we take a look at AC in plant 2. Let's give it some background here. Let's say Rising Sun realizes that, the demand for these flash drive units is really high. What AC decides to do in the long run is they decide to build another plant or to add a piece on or do something. They're going to add on land, labor, capital, and enterprise. They're basically contributing more in the longer run. So they build a second plant. They build a second plant that has more capacity. And we look at AC in plant 2. The building 100 flash drives costs $7. Building 200 costs $6. Building 300 costs $5.50. 400, $5. And then you'll see the price start to rise again. So effectively, if we looked at plant 2, the optimal lowest cost production comes at a level of 400 units. We would say probably plant 2 is 4 times the size of plant 1, or has 4 times the capacity for some reason other than size, more workers, more talent, whatever. So really, that plant 2 is good for making 400 a day economically. And let's say the production continues to go up. We say, well, really 400 a day is not enough. We need to enlarge our plant again. So the plant either gets enlarged or another plant is added. And we look at plant 3, we see the same type of structure happen again, meaning that the price for making a little bit of 100, 200, 300 is relatively high. So we see 100, 750, 200, 650, 300, 6, 400, 570, 500 is 530, 600 is 5, 700 is 530. So what we're seeing is that in plant 3, which is a larger plant, it's not worthwhile to produce 100, 200, 300, 400 units because the plant is so big. We got so many workers, so much space, so much capacity. We're not operating at the optimal capacity if we produce 1 to 2 to 300. We are operating at an optimal capacity if we can produce 600 a day. Anything more than 600 a day, we're overstressing the system. Finally, we'll look at a plant 4 being constructed. So let's assume we build a plant 4, and plant 4 is even larger. Plant 4 has its lowest cost at 800 output, 800 units per day. So plant 4 is really good if we got big production. So you can imagine a firm, any firm, it doesn't matter, any firm will try to build a plant or enlarge a plant or enlarge its company to get their costs as low as possible for the market. So the market for flash drives, let's assume, is growing. And they build larger and larger plants to produce more and more flash drives at an economic cost. So we had to ask ourselves, if the demand for flash drives was 200 a day, what plant size should we have? And the answer would be plant 1, because plant 1 has its lowest cost at 200 a day. Would we go and purchase or build a plant the size of plant 4 to produce 200 a day? Certainly not. If we looked at plant 4, it would cost $7.10 per unit to make 200 units a day. That's not an efficient operation of that plant. That plant can operate efficiently if it were to make 800 units. So what we need to be able to do is to right size our plant to the level of operation and the level of demand for the product. This happened to General Motors, okay? If you want to think about sizing plants in the real world, General Motors had this problem. Back in the 1960s and 70s, General Motors had 60, 80, some huge percent share of the automotive market in North America. Generally, if you were buying a car, that car was most likely a General Motors or a Ford, okay? The big three, Ford or Chrysler, held the bulk of the market. In 1973, that all changed with the oil crisis, and we saw more Japanese products come into the market, lower price, higher quality products. And right through the 70s, market share of General Motors dropped. Through the 80s and the 90s, they also struggled. They struggled very hard. And because they struggled very hard, what we saw was General Motors was too big for its output. The demand for the level of demand for General Motors car fell below the optimal level for the number of plants they had and the capacity they had. So what General Motors, this all came to a head in 2008 when General Motors went bankrupt. During the big recession in the States, General Motors actually went bankrupt. And what we saw was General Motors pulled away from the market. The Pontiac line, the Oldsmobile line, the Saturn line, all of those were thrown in. No more. They didn't exist anymore. They shut down a lot of plants, laid off a lot of people. It was hard. It was hard. But General Motors is shutting down a lot of plants. In Oshawa, Ontario, for example, there was a big plant that GM had to make Pontiacs. A lot of Pontiacs came out of GM out of Oshawa. And that plant actually this past year announced, or this 2 years ago, announced it was closing. And it was going to throw like 15,000 people out of work. Terrible, sad news in the news. But the fact is, General Motors, there's no demand, not the level of demand that General Motors had for its cars. So what they've come up with now is that Oshawa is actually going to switch to making electric vehicles. They're going to start making, government incentives and the like have caused GM to kind of not rethink, but to make a different type of product in that car. We're also looking at organizations like the College in North Atlantic now. You got to consider that the trade school system in Newfoundland was built in 1964 for a 1964 Newfoundland. And if you look at 1964 Newfoundland, 1964 Newfoundland was quite a bit different than it is now. Just let me bring up this and I will show you. This is what's causing a big problem in Newfoundland right now, and the government is wrestling with this. And there's no happy solution to this. This is just a miserable situation that Newfoundland is facing that really there's no simple answer out of. What you should be seeing there now is a population pyramid. Okay, and this issue of the long run that we're talking about here really applies to Newfoundland now and helps explain some of the economic challenges that we're facing in this province. 1971 is the first bit of data that I have. If you look at 1971 Newfoundland, this is age, and this is thousands, relative thousands. This is male and female. So we're really all, for our purposes, we're just looking at the wider it is, the more people are in that age category. Okay. So effectively, if you look here, the bulk of Newfoundland back in 1971 were somewhere between the age of 0 and 25. In fact, our average age back at the time of the centennial, 1967, of Canada was 27 years old. Look at the age and understand why so many trade schools were built in 1964. You know how many kids were coming out of school? You know how much the university grew? You know how much how the post-secondary education system grew in Newfoundland? Because Joey Smallwood said we got to take Newfoundland kicking and screaming into the 21st century. That was Joey's comment. And what we tried to do was to bring up the level of education in Newfoundland. So they built trade schools right across the island and Labrador. So they were in places like Clarenville, Bonavista, Huron, Bayvert, Grand Falls, Springdale. All of these towns were considered as growth centers back in the day. And when you consider that many kids that were going to be coming out of school, it made sense to have that many trade schools. So there was 20 odd of them built. Now, let's bring us up. Let's go a little further along. This is 1990. This is 2001. 2001. This is the turn of the century, okay? What we're seeing in the turn of the century is that group that were down here in 1971 are now quite a bit older. In fact, they've moved ahead about 30 years. Look at them now. They're in this range. Are they the people that go to school? No, they're the working group. They're not in school. Let's bring us up to as close to today as the, this is as close as the statistics information brings us, this 2016. Here's the population of Newfoundland right now. The bulk that were back there in 1971, the me's of the world, are now right here. So we've got a lot of baby boomers who are working through the system who are now somewhere in the retirement, pre-retirement age. Do those people go to school? No. What's happening to the college system now? The college system with 17 campuses, even today, is challenged because the number of students coming out of the school system is shrinking. And as a result, do we need 17 campuses? And that's a question that is very politically laden, no question. But, you know, if you look at some of the smaller centers, back in the early 2000s, they shut down the trade schools in Springdale and a few other towns. Now we're looking at probably doing something like that again, because the reality is that do we need that number of buildings right now? I'm saying to college, but this equally applies to churches, schools, healthcare centers, you name it. And this is the perennial problem that the government of Newfoundland faces. There it is right there in a little nutshell. So the long run, from a Newfoundland perspective, is that if we were to compare it to this, if we were to look at long run and say, oh, yeah, well, this is a neat little topic for business, but it also applies to government. You know, our capacity in terms of the services that are offered are not necessarily right-sized for the market that we're offering it to. Very much a situation of what's going on in our province right now. If we look at this issue of the short run versus the long run, this little graphic here, which took a lot to draw, really demonstrates the fact that the long run is just made up of a bunch of short runs. The little gray U's, the little gray ones here, represent the short run. And what we saw in the short run, if I just want to bring your memory back, the short run, what we could do is we could increase our labor, and we saw that the costs were going down, 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 down to a low point, and then they started coming back up again, if you recall from last week. So we got to look for just the right sweet spot to get our productivity good by reducing our costs. And what happens if this were today, tomorrow is going to be right here, and the next day, and the next day. So basically, you got a firm that operates in a series of successive short runs. Well, what we're going to find is that over the long run, the short runs will follow a pattern. In other words, let's say if we just flip back to here, let's assume that AC1 was short run number one, okay? So here's short run number one. And then we decide, okay, let's enlarge the size of our plant and build AC number two. So we're going over here. We're going to build this type of plant that gets our costs down. Here's our second short run, and the third and the fourth, and so on. So this basically 1, 2, 3, 4 is 4 versions of the short run of this company. What we're showing is that, yeah, as we increase our output, this is along the bottom is quantity, right? As we increase our output, we can get our cost of production down. And it will go down. It will go down, but it will follow a pattern that says it will go down to a point, and then it will level off. And then if we keep adding and adding, as what happened to General Motors, they kept adding plants. They got really big. In fact, there was a saying in the United States that General Motors was too big to fail. In other words, so many hundreds of thousands of people work for General Motors that if it did fail, it would cause such a disruption to the economy that it would crucify the economy. And this is why in 2008, the U.S. federal government and even the Canadian federal government here north of the border put hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars into General Motors to keep it alive, despite the fact that it was in bankruptcy. Because it was just too big to fail. Too many people would have lost their jobs if government allowed it to fail. So what we see is that the short runs will take a pattern that follows a slope that is almost identical to the short run slope. The short run follows a U pattern. The long run follows a U pattern too. The reason is is that as we increase our size, our company gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and up to right here, in terms of our level of output, up to right here, we are getting what's called economies of scale. We're getting big enough so we can get our average costs down. So our average cost per unit of production is dropping as we get bigger. And we've seen that illustrated in this example right here. Notice our average costs are lower as we add production. Okay, so the bigger the plant, we can find that sweet spot. So our costs go down. This is called economies of scale. And generally, when we're talking about in the news media, or we're talking about, I'll call it low-level economics. Low-level economics, which is what the general public see all the time, is that bigger is better. As we get bigger, as a company gets bigger, larger in size, builds more plants, Amazon, for example, is growing now. As we get bigger, we get better economies of scale for a number of reasons, and we'll look at the reasons in the next class. As we get bigger, our costs will drop. So actually, there is a good size, and that good size is big. Okay? Now, when we get this big, when we get to right here, we keep adding capacity by building more plants, but what we're finding is that we can't squeeze the lemon any harder. In other words, we've got our lowest possible cost, and it doesn't really change too much, despite the fact that we're growing. So we grow in size, our plants get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but we're not getting our costs any lower. We're so efficient. We're so efficient, we're so big, that really we can't squeeze any more lemon out of the lemon. The lemon juice out of the lemon. And this is what's called a period of constant returns to scale. So you can imagine a company like General Motors back in 1923, they got bigger and bigger and bigger, built more plants, and they had a bigger share of the market. They got their costs down. They were making oodles of money. Oodles of money. Right up through the 60s, they were really, really big, and they were so efficient. Man, it was a money-making machine. And then we saw 1973 hit right here, and that was when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies jacked up the price of oil. North America was very dependent on the Saudi Arabian oil. They doubled the price of oil overnight. We saw North America was shocked by the fact that oil went up. You think the price of gas is high now. Well, you can imagine the shock that happened in 1973, and the price of gas doubled overnight. It was cheap, and then it went to much higher overnight. Here were all us Americans, all us people driving North American cars, I say, with huge monsters, 400 cubic inch cars, these sorts of things, gas guzzlers, basically. These gas guzzlers suddenly became unpopular. And American car companies didn't make small cars, or didn't make cars that were relatively fuel efficient, but the Japanese did. And we saw a huge voice in the market for Japanese cars. So what we saw is that the demand for General Motors cars after 1973 fell off. In other words, their percentage of market share dropped. So their plants were so big that actually they had so many people employed, so many older people, good union contracts, these sorts of things, that they were so big that they actually started becoming inefficient. And we saw the diseconomies of scale happening. In other words, they were building plants, continuing to build plants, but it was plants for products that nobody wanted. So we saw a good example of their average cost rising. And this did them in 2008 when the economy fell apart down in the States and General Motors went bankrupt. So we tend to see three distinctive parts: economies of scale, constant returns to scale, and diseconomies of scale. Right now, the Amazons of the world, the favorite companies today, the Facebooks, the Amazons of the world, you could say, yeah, they're getting good mileage out of this. In fact, they might have moved down here in the last couple of years. Why? Look at what happened to Facebook this past week. Facebook reorganized itself, and it got its Its parent company is now called Meta. You've probably seen that in the news. And the reason that they've done this is because Facebook's been under a lot of criticism for the degree to which they moderate their website and the stuff that's on it. And they get a lot of backlash. And the argument is Facebook's gotten too big. They have too much control over the social media market. So right now, they're into this stage. And in fact, they could potentially be running up in the diseconomies of scale where they're too big for their own good and they're running into problems. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, the costs of monitoring their site, or if government regulation comes in that says they can't go posting stuff that's not true, the anti-vaxxers and that kind of stuff. The cost of maintaining the site could go up, and they could see that they're just too big. Can Zuckerberg control 300,000 people who work for Facebook in a way that turns the ship? It's like trying to move the Titanic away from the iceberg. We're pointed towards the iceberg. It's hard to move a big ship as it's going forward. So we're running into some diseconomies of scale there. So what we typically see is that our long-run average costs decrease in economies of scale. And you can see the short runs here. We get, for example, plant 1 has really good economies at that level, plant 2 really good at that level, plant 3 at that level. So as we get larger and our quantities go up, our average costs drop. Most companies will want to be here, but as we move through, we end up running into a phase where we hit what's called constant recurrence to scale. And then if we're unlucky, we get so big that we run into diseconomies of scale.